We're swinging into a different mode this afternoon. Our first speaker is going to come from the father's perspective, the family perspective, the parents' perspective. Pete Earley, in a Washington magazine's cover story entitled Top Journalists, Washington's Media Elite, Pete Earley was described as one of a handful of journalists in America who have the power to introduce new ideas and give them currency. A former reporter for the Washington Post, he is the author of 9 nonfiction books and 3 novels. His first book, Family of Spies, Inside the John Walker Spy Ring, was a New York Times bestseller, and it was made into a 5-hour miniseries shown on CBS. For his book, The Hot House, Life Inside Leavenworth Prison, Earley spent a full year as a reporter inside a maximum security prison. His book, Circumstantial Evidence, helped lead to the release of a black man from death row after he had been wrongly convicted of murdering a white teenager in Alabama. His book, Crazy, A Father's Search Through America's Mental Health Madness, tells 2 stories. It describes his attempts to help his son, Mike, after he becomes ill with bipolar disorder and is arrested. It also describes a year that Earley spent at the Miami-Dade County Jail, where he followed persons with mental disorders who had been in jail out in the community and back in jail and back out into the community, and you know the circle, and to see what type of services they received, and probably more importantly, what type of services they should be receiving. His book was one of 2 finalists for the Pulitzer Prize in 2007, and he has won awards from Mental Health America and the American Psychiatric Association. But one of the things that's not on the introduction that I got prepared that I remember talking to Pete about was when his book came out, was Anderson Cooper was the only journalist that had him on one of those nightly programs because Anderson Cooper lost his brother to suicide. Ladies and gentlemen, Pete Earley.
Good afternoon. I am delighted to be here. This has been such a wonderful conference. I love listening to Fred, and Lizzie did a good job, but Fred's always been a mentor to me. I look at him and it gives me hope for my son. What a wonderful family to put on this symposium. Thank you very much. I was talking to Josh last night and I told him a story. A few months ago I was speaking in Philadelphia, and after I got done I was signing books, and a couple came up to me and they were both in tears. They were crying and sobbing, and they told me that their son had killed himself. And then they looked at me and they said, and we're both psychiatrists, and we couldn't save our son. Suicide is a mystery. It's a horrible thing, and it's difficult for us to understand. But I think it's helpful to know that even 2 psychiatrists, and one of them was very prominent, could not solve this problem, could not save their son. You know, I did a little research before I came out because I wanted to be better acquainted about suicide, and I was shocked to read that approximately 2 million young people between the ages of 15 to 24, 2 million will attempt suicide. 700,000 of them will require medical attention, and 4,000 of them will succeed, making it the 3rd leading cause of death among 15 to 24-year-olds. And of course it's in the news now, Corey Haim, Marie Osmond's son. And it's a special concern to any of us who have a loved one with a mental disorder, because 90% of young suicide victims have had a mental disorder. And it's never far from my mind, because my story begins with my son asking me these words: Dad, what would you do if someone you loved tried to kill himself? My college-age son, Mike, asked me that question while we were racing down Interstate 95 from Manhattan to Fairfax, Virginia, where I live. Mike had been diagnosed a year earlier with a mental disorder, bipolar disorder. A psychiatrist had prescribed him medication, but my son had stopped taking his pills. And when I picked him up in Manhattan earlier that morning, he'd been wandering around for 5 days. He hadn't slept. He was convinced that God had him on a secret mission. And during that 4-hour frantic ride from Manhattan to Fairfax, Virginia, he would laugh one minute and then begin sobbing in intense pain the next. And I pleaded with him, "Son, take your medication." And he looked at me and he said, "Pills are poison, leave me alone." And we got to the hospital, and I remember the nurse rolling her eyes as Mike talked gibberish about how God had him on this special mission. And then we were taken to a room to wait, and that's exactly what we did for the next 4 hours. And finally my son said, "I've had enough. Obviously there's nothing wrong. I don't need to be here. I'm going to leave." I said, hang on. And I raced outside and I flagged down a doctor. And I will never forget how that doctor came into that room. He came in with his hands up as if he was surrendering. He says, I'm sorry, Mr. Earley, I can't help your son." I said, "You haven't even examined him." And he explained to me that it didn't matter. Virginia law was very specific. Unless a person posed an imminent danger, either themselves or someone else, they could not be required to undergo treatment or be forced to take medication. And the fact that we'd been sitting there for 4 hours and no one had hurt anyone was proof there was no danger. And the nurse had told the doctor that my son believed that pills were poison. And so the doctor turned to me and very cavalierly said, "I'll tell you what, bring your son back after he tries to kill you or he tries to kill someone else." Now, I took my son home, and for the next 48 hours, I watched my son sink deeper and deeper into a mental abyss. At one point, he had tin foil wrapped around his head as he was watching TV because he was afraid the CIA was going to be reading his thoughts. He slipped out of my house early one morning. He slipped out. He broke into a stranger's house. Luckily, no one was there. He broke in to take a bubble bath. It took 5 police officers to get him out of that house. And when they did, they took him to a community mental health treatment center, and they called me, and I raced over, and a policeman was waiting outside, and he said, "Wait a minute, Mr. Earley, before you go in there, let me give you a little advice. Even though your son has told us that he has bipolar disorder, he's off his medication, he broke into a house to take a bubble bath, luckily no one was there, even though he's told us all this, unless you go in and you tell that psychiatrist that your son threatened to kill you, he still will not meet Virginia's imminent danger clause. And we'll take him to jail rather than a hospital. Those are your 2 choices." And I looked at him and I said, "But my son hasn't threatened to kill me." And he shrugged and he walked away. So I'm here to tell you today, and I do this with no pride and much embarrassment because it hurt my relationship with my son, but I went in and I lied. I said my son had threatened to kill me, and that was good enough to get him taken to a hospital where 48 hours later he voluntarily committed himself. But our problems were far from over. 24 hours after my son was admitted into that hospital, I got a call from his psychiatrist. Our insurance company wanted him out. And I called that insurance company, and I got absolutely nowhere until I happened to mention that I used to work at the Washington Post, and I happened to mention that I was a good friend of Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes. Now, journalists are not supposed to bully people, but I did, and my son was allowed to stay in that hospital a record-breaking 5 days. In the short time between our trip from New York to Mike's hospitalization, I had lied to get him in the hospital. I violated my ethics and keep him there. And just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. I got a call from the Fairfax County Police. My son was being charged with 2 felonies, breaking, entering, and destruction of property. I was so frustrated. Virginia law had kept me from getting my son help when he needed it. Now it wanted to punish him for a crime he'd committed when he wasn't thinking clearly. I just feel so frustrated and helpless. I told my wife Patty one night, "I want to help our son, but I don't know how to do it." "Then do what you do best," she said. "Pete Earley, a father, can't find out much, but Pete Earley, a journalist, can. Investigate this and try to find out what in the world's going on in our mental health system." So, a wise man, I took my wife's advice. And I did a little digging. And I discovered that what happened to my son isn't some aberration. It wasn't some freak occurrence. Right now, as we're sitting here in Santa Cruz, there are 350,000 people with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and major depression in our jails and prisons. There are 500,000 on probation. More than 700,000 go through the criminal justice system every year. And as many of you as Californians know, the largest public mental facility in the United States today is not a treatment center, it's the Los Angeles County Jail. Those statistics gave me an idea, but before I pursued it, I wanted to talk to Mike. I said, Mike, I'm thinking about writing a book about what happened to you. And he looked at me and he said, well, who would want to read that? I said, no, I'm going to take your story and I'm going to find a jail somewhere far away from Fairfax County because I don't want to risk irritating a judge or a prosecutor. And I'm going to go in that jail and I'm going to find people who clearly have mental illnesses and I'm going to follow them through the system and see what happens to them. And then I'll go back and I'll talk to a judge and a prosecutor and a defense attorney and the mental health providers and the consumers and their parents and the police, and I'll try to make sense of it all. And he looked at me and he said, if it helps someone else, Dad, tell my story. Well, I began at the Twin Towers, Los Angeles County Jail. Makes sense. Largest public mental facility. I lasted 2 days before they asked me to leave, citing HIPAA violations. I tried Chicago next, they said no. I tried New York, Rikers Island next, they said no. I tried Baltimore, they said no. I tried Washington, D.C., my hometown, and they looked at me and they said, hell no. The only place I could get into was the Miami-Dade County Jail because of a futuristic thinking, I should say, judge down there who said, I'll get you in. And I remember going into C Wing for the first time, trying to take in every sight and every sound around you as a reporter. There are 19 cells in C Wing. It's a suicide wing. The cells it's a U-shaped cell block. The cells all have plexiglass fronts that look out. The officers walk up and down the center. And when I stepped in there, I took a moment, I smelled the air, and there was a putrefied scent. And I looked at those cells, and I saw in those cells men completely naked in cells with nothing in them. And the cells were kept cold, bone-chilling cold, but there were no blankets. And because the jail was old and the water system broke down frequently, men drank from the toilets. And when I stood there and watched, you could hear the normal jail sounds of men coughing and doors shutting. But when you listen closer, you could hear the asylum sounds of persons screaming at some unseen tormentor. And then I heard a thud, thud, thud. Then faster, thud, thud, thud. Then louder, thud, thud, thud. And it was one of the inmates. He was running forward. He was smashing his forehead in the plexiglass, splitting it open. I ain't crazy, he screamed. Then quit acting like you is, the unconcerned officer called back. Now, the officers, I got to know on this, they called this the forgotten floor. And I thought they were talking about the inmates. They were talking about themselves too. Now, one officer had received any kind of training to work with persons with mental illness. And even worse, every one of the officers who worked on that floor told me they had been sent to work with the crazies as punishment because their bosses didn't like them. They wanted to give them the worst job in the jail and they hoped they'd quit. My tour guide was Dr. Joseph Portier, a fabulous psychiatrist with an impossible job. A lot of people think, he told me, that you can get someone help if they go into a jail. But we're a jail, we're not a hospital. We don't help people here. I went with him on his morning rounds, and that day there were 92 inmates on the 9th floor, and his rounds took us 19 and a half minutes. If you do the math, you'll see we spent 12.7 seconds talking to each inmate. Now, during the next 10 months, I shadowed several inmates through the Miami legal system, and the first one I want to talk to you about was named Alice Ann Collier. She had chronic schizophrenia. She'd been homeless for more than a decade. She lived on the streets in South Beach in an alleyway. She slept next to a dumpster at night. And when I checked her records, I'd found out she'd been arrested 10 times in just the last 4 years, but she'd never gotten any help for her mental illness. And this time she was in jail because she was walking by a bus stop and her eyes locked with an older woman who was waiting for a bus. And Alice Ann suddenly screamed, "Stop stealing my thoughts!" And she raced up and she shoved the older woman, not hard enough to knock her over, but she shoved her, and then she ran off. And well-meaning witnesses came up and said, "Get her arrested. You get her arrested. Get her off the streets before she hurts someone. Get her arrested and she'll get help." Well, help is not what Alice Ann got. Florida takes its crimes against the elderly very seriously because so many elderly people retire in Florida. They are automatically felonies. And because Alice Ann had shoved 2 other elderly people at bus stops, she was charged under the state's 3 strikes law, which meant that she faced a mandatory, non-negotiable 5 years in prison. But when she was taken before the judge, he looked down and he said, "I can't put this person on trial. They're incompetent. They don't know what's going on. Send them to the state hospital in Chattahoochee to be made competent." Not treated, made competent. And there's a difference. Treatment means you actually get help. And that's not what happened with Alice Ann Collier. Every day she was taken into a room and she was shown 3 chairs. On one chair was written the word judge, on the next one prosecutor, the third one defense attorney. And when Alice Ann could tell her keepers who sat in each chair, she was deemed competent enough to be put on trial and she was sent back to the jail. Well, of course, she was still psychotic, and she was taken before the judge, and he looked at her and he said, "What's going on here? I sent you away to be made competent. Go back to Chattahoochee." So they put her on the bus, and off she goes. When I found Alice Ann Collier in the Miami jail, she had been traveling between the jail and the state hospital 1,151 days, more than 3 years, and she'd never been put on trial. Now I'm a reporter. I took out my little pen and paper, and I wrote it all down. I went running over to the prosecutor's office. "Look what I found. Look what I found." And the prosecutor told me, with no embarrassment, that they knew exactly what they were doing to Alice Ann Collier. In fact, they planned to keep her for 5 years because that's the maximum they could do before they had to release her. Now, why were they keeping her on that bus? Because she was dangerous. Medication didn't seem to help her become stable. And there was no safe place in the entire state of Florida. No hospital beds, no long-term treatment facilities, no place. So they were keeping her on that bus, riding her back and forth to keep her off the streets. And she was typical. The persons with mental illness that I was finding in the jail were not Hannibal Lecter serial killers. They were men and women who had bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and major depression. You know, after my book was published, I was fortunate and I got called before Congress to testify at a subcommittee. But before I testified, they had a panel of experts, supposedly the best and the brightest from the National Institutes of Mental Health from Johns Hopkins University. They got up there to testify. And they all said exactly the same thing. Drum roll, please. That bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and major depression are illnesses. And they're not the fault of the person who gets them. The heart can get sick and so can the mind. And according to the National Institutes of Mental Health, 70% of persons with these disorders can be helped by medication, and that recovery rate can climb even higher if an ill person is given other proven recovery tools. But first you have to be able to get someone their medication or get them into some kind of treatment that helps them recover. Consider April Hernandez. She's the same age as my son. She was in jail when I met her for stealing a car, and when I investigated her case, I found out she'd been framed. Who'd framed her? Her very own parents. They'd conspired with relatives to get her arrested and put in jail. Why? Because she was psychotic, she was homeless, she was living on the streets of South Beach, where she had been gang raped twice and attacked 3 times by teenagers swinging baseball bats who thought it was hilarious to attack homeless people on the street. And her mental situation had been masked for years because as a teenager she'd started using drugs, and everybody thought, oh, it's the drugs that are making her have this erratic behavior. It was only after she was correctly diagnosed as having co-occurring problems that they realized that the drug addiction was self-medication to try to help her underlying mental disorder. The last person I want to talk to you about today, Freddie Gilbert. Everybody in this room knows of Freddie Gilbert. A Miami study found that at any given time in Miami, in a population of 2 million, there were 1,700 people who were living on the streets, in cars, sleeping in parks. They were the homeless. But that same study found of those 1,700 people, most were able, when given services, to move into some kind of subsidized or temporary housing. That wasn't true, however, for 507 individuals. They were the chronic homeless. And in Miami, those 507 living on the streets, every one of them had a severe mental illness. And every one of them had been arrested more than once. Now, when I met Freddie Gilbert in the jail, he was so sick. He was so psychotic, he could not speak. He stood naked in his cell, and he grunted, and the officers controlled him by giving him sandwiches as if he were a dog performing for treats. And when I checked his record, I found out he'd been in and out of that Miami jail dozens of times without ever getting any help for his brain disorder. And this was because he was charged with misdemeanors, and under Florida law, he could not be sent to a treatment program, even if one were available. And the result was he was stuck in this revolving door. They're called frequent flyers, a term I don't like, but 2 or 3 weeks on the street, back in jail, back in... How in the world did we get into this situation? Well, many of you are professionals, and you know our painful history. Back as far as I'm concerned, from a historic perspective, we've really come full circle. Back in colonial days, if you had a mental disorder, you had to depend on your family. You were in jail, or you were warned out, which meant the sheriff took you to the county line. He warned you to keep walking and told you never to come back. In 1843, Fred mentioned this earlier, activist Dorothea Dix was on her way to Boston. She got into the jail there. She was going to teach a Bible lesson, and as she's walking through the jail, she realizes that persons with mental disorders are being kept in a part of the jail where there's no heat. And she goes to see the jailer, and she says, you can't treat people this way. And he looks at her and he goes, oh, the lunatics? Well, they're not like us. They don't feel the cold. We don't need to heat their cells. And for the next 3 decades, Dix preached that persons with mental illnesses needed treatment, not punishment, because of their affliction. And she argued for the building of state hospitals to help persons. And she personally persuaded 30 states to open up hospitals. Well, we all know what happened next. Within the next 50 years, many of these hospitals had become abusive giant warehouses where persons with mental illness were locked up and forgotten. One newspaper reporter in Oklahoma, my native state, in the 1960s, and I see a few of us out there who remember the 1960s, described the state hospitals there, get this, as being worse than Nazi concentration camps. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy heard the cries for reform, and he called on Congress to spend $3 billion. Sounds like chump change today, doesn't it? $3 billion to replace the nation's state hospitals with a new system based on community-based mental health centers. The discovery of a promising drug, Thorazine, seemed to make it possible for people to move out of these locked wards and into our communities. And Kennedy's plan called for the creation of 2,000 community mental health treatment centers. Well, what happened? Kennedy was assassinated. The Vietnam War escalated. Congress got ensnarled in Watergate. Thorazine turned out not to be as wonderful as everybody thought. Neighborhoods proved not to be as welcoming as they should have. In short, that $3 billion didn't get spent as it was supposed to. Those 2,000 centers never got opened as they were supposed to. And next came deinstitutionalization, the closing of these giant hospitals. And it was a fabulous idea that turned quickly into a cruel joke. And that's because states around this country began closing down their hospitals and pushing people out the front door with literally no place, no safety net in their community for people to go. And thousands of sick patients moved out in the streets and then began filtering into our jails. Let's look specifically at California. In 1957, in California, there were 37,000 people in state mental hospitals. 1 year after deinstitutionalization began, In California, in 1968, that number dropped by 19,000. In other words, it was immediately cut in half in one single year. And as of 2005, which was the only number I found on the internet, the state population in hospitals had dropped to 535. Now, I was surprised when I investigated the history of deinstitutionalization. Because I'd seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I'd heard the horror stories, and I figured we closed down these places because it was the right thing to do. Because we wanted compassion and concern, and we wanted to help these people. Check your records, and you'll find out that the driving force behind deinstitutionalization was not compassion, it wasn't concern, it was money. State legislators were being pushed into a corner. Exposés had been written about how horrible these state hospitals were. The public was putting pressure on people. They were going to have to spend millions and millions and millions of dollars to fix these places up. They were facing lawsuits. And the states didn't know what to do. And then Uncle Sam came riding in and says, "Don't you worry, we'll take care of it. We're going to take care of persons who have mental illness. We'll give them Medicaid, and we'll take care of them. We'll take care of all Social Security. We'll handle it, but only if they're not in those institutions." And when that happened, the state legislators went, "Yippee! Let's let Uncle Sam handle this." And they began pushing people out the door. Now, another event happened in 1980 that created the perfect storm for where we are today. President Ronald Reagan was elected, and we sent him to Washington and we said, "We're tired of all those federal programs. We want you to start cutting. Let's cut down the size of the federal government." And he did. Housing alone during the Reagan presidency was cut from $32 billion and $7 billion. From $32 billion to $7 billion. Again, creating a huge homeless population. Well, it's been 4 decades since deinstitutionalization. It's been nearly 3 decades since the Reagan Revolution. So why are our jails and our prisons filling up with persons whose only real crime is that they got sick? Well, the biggest reason is, even though we have spent millions and millions of dollars, we still do not have adequate community services to help persons with mental illness. Let's go back to Miami for an example. Not everyone with a mental disorder in Miami is stuck in the jail. There are 4,500 people with severe mental illnesses who live in the city of Miami. They live in 650 boarding homes, assisted living facilities, and it's fabulous. We took them out of those state institutions and we put them back in our community. But let's look at those 650 boarding homes. Of those 650 boarding homes, 400 cannot pass the minimum standard to be open as a boarding home. In other words, they have exemptions. In other words, if you tried to put anybody but somebody who had a mental health diagnosis in that home, it wouldn't be allowed. One of the ones I visited had a hole in the ceiling, rain poured through, medication was scattered on a kitchen table. The tenants only spoke English. The caretaker only spoke Spanish. Meals were rice and beans. There was no therapy. There was no treatment. There was nothing but watching TV and smoking cigarettes. And I'm telling you, in this case, we haven't improved these people's lives by taking them out of state hospitals. We're just hiding them better. Now, it's easy for a reporter to criticize the owners of these slum houses. But let's take a little deeper look. The average operator of a boarding home in Miami is paid $29.90 per day to provide all services, food, clothing, shelter, everything, to a person with mental illness. When I travel, I put my dog in, and you know I'm from Washington, the Dulles Executive Pet Center. They charge me $31 a day to feed my dog, take my dog on a 15-minute walk, and give it its medication. In other words, I pay $1 more per day to take care of my dog than what we're paying people in Miami to take care of people who have severe mental illnesses. Let's look a little closer at my home. I'm sorry, I know you folks in Santa Cruz are all rich Californians, but those folks in Fairfax, Virginia, where we have double incomes because everybody's a federal worker, have an average household income of $150,000 per household. The average in this country is $42,000, by the way. So you'd think, wow, you must have great mental health services. There is a 2-week wait to get into a program if you live in Fairfax County and have a mental illness. There is a 6-month wait to get a case manager. And get this, there is an 18-year wait to get into a housing program. 18-year wait if you have a mental illness. Is it any wonder that I call my book crazy? I'm not talking about people like my son. I'm talking about our system. Now, besides not having a viable community safety net, there's other reasons. In the 1980s, civil rights attorneys right here in California began filing a barrage of mental health litigation as part of an outgrowth of the civil rights movement. Fred was talking about this. The most notable one was the Lanterman-Petrus Short Act of '67. It became a model for other states. And the civil rights opponent said, hey, look, you shouldn't be arrested just because you have a mental illness. And that's right. Having a mental illness shouldn't be a crime. And they said, look, you shouldn't be dragged off the street and forced to have a lobotomy or given some kind of treatment you don't want. And most of all, and they made no effort to hide this, they said, we want to target commitment laws on the theory that it is good to keep people out of state institutions. And they set out to make commitment as nearly as impossible as it could be. And the key language became that imminent danger criteria. And as Fred said earlier, a judge ruled that a man with chronic schizophrenia who was sleeping under cars at night and eating his own feces was not considered an imminent danger. In my opinion, tough involuntary commitment laws that focus only on dangerousness and were originally intended to protect people from being unfairly locked up are now being used by many states to deny them services, often to save them money. People such as my son are refused treatment until they violate the law, even if they have a long history of mental illness and are helped by medication. The tragedy of Virginia Tech has called new attention on when do we intervene, when do we step in, when do we violate someone's civil rights and say, I'm sorry, you have to go into treatment. But I would argue that changing the focus off dangerousness does not mean that you are in favor of stripping away someone's civil rights. In recent years, 23 states have changed their laws to include a need for treatment. In North Dakota, language was added to see if there'd been a substantial deterioration in mental health. There's other programs where they're trying to use peer-to-peer rather than doctors to describe when somebody needs help. I love my son. And I want his civil rights protected. And I know how horribly we have treated people in this country who have mental illness. But I would argue that it does neither an ill person or society any good to have a doctor say, bring your son back after he tries to kill you or he tries to kill someone else. We must find a better way to help ensure civil rights and protect people, but also give people who are clearly psychotic meaningful help rather than waiting until they become dangerousness or pose a threat to someone and are arrested. In addition to deinstitutionalization, a continued failure to fund community services, overly restrictive laws that focus only on dangerousness, there's another reason why our jails and prisons have become our new asylums. Initially, managed health care, HMO, was supposed to be the solution for everyone. It was supposed to make health care affordable, but by 1997, 2/3 of HMOs were controlled by for-profit companies. And as a result, acute care, psychiatric beds in hospitals are beginning to completely disappear. Why? Because they are not profitable. Surgical units are, emergency rooms like that are, psychiatric beds are not. In Northern Virginia, where I live, 24% of private hospital beds for psychiatric patients were closed down in just 2005. And meanwhile, the states are closing down the state hospitals because we want to treat people in our communities. And as a result, there is a complete lack of emergency psychiatric service beds when people are in crisis. A University of Virginia study estimated that in the next 12 months, the next 12 months in Virginia, where I live, 2,400 people who would meet the dangerousness criteria will not get any help because there are no beds available. That's shameful. And if you think California is immune, do some checking. The national standard is about 50 critical care emergency beds per 100,000 persons. 50. You have 17.5 on the average. So how are we responding to this crisis? We have turned mental illness from a health problem into a criminal justice problem. Despite our economic downturn, communities are spending millions to improve their jails and prisons. They're building modern psychiatric diagnostic units inside jails to figure out what to do with people who get arrested. And I'm so glad we're closing places down like the Miami jail. But building psychiatric facilities in jails and prisons is not where we should be spending our money. We shouldn't require a person who has a brain disorder to get committed in order to get help. And that is where we're going in many parts of this country. I recently spoke in Alabama, and before I did, one of their state's top mental health people got up and he bragged about how if you had a mental illness in Alabama today, the best thing that could happen to you is you'd get arrested, because then you'd get into the continuum of care. That's wrong. Because of our current crisis, communities are setting up mental health courts and jail diversion programs, and they're fabulous. I endorse them. They're wonderful ideas. I hope you have them here. But there's a lesson we should have learned with deinstitutionalization that we seem to have forgotten. Diverting a psychotic person from jail or prison is fabulous, if you got somewhere to divert them to. If that community does not have any meaningful treatment or recovery programs, no access to affordable medication, no acute care hospital beds, no longer-term beds where people are extremely sick can get ongoing help until they're stable and return to the communities, no peer-to-peer, no jobs, no certain community access teams, no housing, and no hope for recovery, then what are you accomplishing? Improving and broadening community mental health services is where we need to be spending our tax dollars, not in building more jails. We need to fund early screening, early mental health intervention programs so we can help people while they're young. We need to put money behind evidence-based recovery empowerment programs, behind suicide prevention programs, behind services such as drop-in centers and clubhouses and job programs. And we need to coordinate our mental health services with law enforcement, make them partners. And every community in America should have a crisis intervention trained police department and correctional officers who know how to deal with persons who are in a psychotic episode. And housing. It's essential to mental health. You can't separate mental health treatment and housing. And put simply, we need to turn this back into a health problem and stop making it a criminal justice one. People say to me, thank you. People say to me, mental illness, schizophrenia, it's hopeless. We just can't do anything. And I reply with one word, bull. And I clean that up for you. There are many, many successful programs in our nation. Since my book's been published, I've been to 46 states. I've toured over 100 programs. I've seen amazing things. The LAMP program in downtown LA has a 85% success rate in getting people who are homeless off the street and into a house and some kind of treatment. Why? Because it's housing first. Rather than looking at someone saying, you better get off your drugs and get off that alcohol, and then maybe we'll help you, we say, get them off the street. How can you concentrate on your mental illness if you're on the street with no cover over your head and you're looking in trash cans trying to find stuff to eat? Get you into a house first. Fort Wayne, Indiana, they have a fabulous jobs program patterned after Fountain House, which is what Fred was talking about earlier. Okay, Pete, you can't work a 40-hour work. So what? Well, you work 3 hours, and then we'll get Sally to come in, and she'll work a few hours. People do get better. People do recover. I found a program in Miami. Now listen to this. This program was doing the seemingly impossible. It was taking people with schizophrenia, supposedly the worst mental illness, People who had committed serious crimes such as murder. It was taking them out of jails and prisons, putting them back in the community. Now how in the world was that possible? Well, the program was called Passageway. And at Passageway, residents got individualized care. Now, because most of these people, all of them actually, were charged with serious crimes, they weren't given a choice, they had to take medication. But doctors worked with them to find medications that helped them, that was tailored to their individual needs. They just didn't give them the cheapest drug. And then the doctors at Passageway did something that was really, really revolutionary. The psychiatrists actually talked to their patients. My son has had 9 psychiatrists. Of those 9, only 2 have known more than his name and his symptoms. And that's because psychiatrists are taught that these are organic brain diseases, and insurance companies pressure psychiatrists to get patients out to the door into less expensive hands, social workers. So they have turned them into pill pushers. What medication you need? Fine. Are you working? Fine. Thanks. Go. I'll see you in a week or 2. That's wrong. Treating the head also requires treating the heart, treating the whole person. At Passageway, people were assigned jobs. It didn't matter if it was working 40 hours a week or wiping down a table, they were assigned jobs. Why? Because jobs give you a sense of accomplishment, a sense of purpose. At Passageway, persons were involved to get involved in peer-to-peer. Why? Because helping someone else makes you feel better about yourself. You support each other. At Passageway, they got excellent case management, and they were helped to take over their own illnesses and how to treat them, empowerment. And they were encouraged to go to school and have dreams and fulfill those dreams. And clients were given housing. It's so essential. And then they were given something else. They were given hope. They were told they could get better, and many, many, many of them did. But most important of all, they were part of a community. You know, Tom Mullen, the program's director, told me something really amazing. It was a simple solution, he said. He had created a real asylum, not a place off in the boondocks where people were locked up and forgotten, but a parish is what he called it. A place where persons with mental illness were not stigmatized and not isolated and not shunned, but were truly accepted as part of a society. Now, I know the community acceptance may sound Pollyannish to some, but I saw how important it was at Passageway. And now I'm going to say something you're not going to like. Like cancer, not everyone will survive. These are cruel diseases, and we need to stop abandoning the sickest among us to die on the streets, and instead find ways to rescue them from their illnesses and keep them safe. Which brings us to the next point. What can you do? First of all, never underestimate the power of one person to make a difference. Fort Wayne, Indiana, dentist, his son is killed by suicide by cops. He did what this family did. He decided he was going to do something about it. He went to Fountain House in New York. He started a jobs program, a clubhouse. That has completely changed that whole community. One person did it. Margaret Mead said it best when she said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." What can you do? Speak out. Help educate people about mental illness. Explain that these are illnesses that can strike anyone. And the people who get them deserve treatment, not punishment, not stigma. Fight stigma. Right now, the face of mental illness is a psychotic gunman on the Virginia Tech campus. It shouldn't be. It should be Mike Wallace. It should be Patty Duke. It should be Representative Joseph Kennedy. It should be Terry Bradshaw. Tell your stories. It's much harder for somebody to walk by a person who's homeless and psychotic on the street if they recognize that that's their son, that's their daughter, that's somebody's brother, someone's sister. What can you do? Educate your politicians. Everybody knows we're in tough economic times. Every politician's going to say, "Sorry, we have no money. Who am I going to cut?" Well, let's see. Mental health's a good target because they don't give me money and they don't have any voting clout. Educate your politicians. Tell them, okay, well, guess what? You know that money you're spending? You're wasting some of it. How are you wasting it? Let's go back to Miami. There are 1,200 inmates in Miami jail who have severe mental illnesses. Those inmates are costing $100,000 a day, and they're not getting any better. That's $36 million that city is paying to warehouse people with mental illness. For half that, you could put them into housing and get an ACT team, a assertive community treatment team in there, and actually help them get better, and you'd save $18 million. Freddie Gilbert, Miami, the guy I talked about, costs that city $60,000 a year, and all he's doing is running back and forth between jails. Remind them that studies show for $1 spent on substance abuse, there's a $4 to $7 saving. By redirecting funds from jails and prisons and crisis-driven services like emergency rooms and homeless shelters into life-saving services such as supportive housing, you state and local governments can invest up front in initiatives that over the long run will save them more money, and that makes a lot more sense than what we're doing now, which leads to use of emergency rooms, shelters, jails, and unending growth in Medicaid, corrections, and emergency budgets. Tell your politicians that they are losing money by not helping people with mental illness in ways they don't even know. The Washington Post did a story. It decided, let's find out who makes 911 calls. The number one guy in Washington, D.C. who made 911 calls had schizophrenia. He called over 500 times. Now, because we're Washington, the nation's capital, and we do things so efficiently, every one of those calls cost an average of $500. That is the problem, the money that was wasted because of untreated mental illness. What can you do? Never give up. Like most parents, after Mike's first breakdown, I thought, oh, this was just one of those things that happened to college kids. He'll get over it. He'll be fine. And for 2 years, he did fabulous. He did great. He got a job. He was selling shoes. He was happy. They were talking about management. He was doing great. And then as soon as his probation ended, and this is my son's story, he quit taking his medication. I could see him slipping. When we have a crisis mobilization team, sounds great. I called it up. I said, my son's off his meds. He's beginning to slip. Let me tell you what happened whoa, is he dangerous? I said, well, no, he's not dangerous. Let me tell you, you can't judge him on the past. Okay, I understand that, but call us the night he's dangerous. The night my son became violent, the night he became dangerous, I called. I said, please, please, my son's violent. We need your help. And that same dispatcher said to me, oh, wait a minute, is he dangerous or is he violent? And I said, he's violent. And he says, oh, we don't come if they're violent. Call the police. Well, the police came, and my son was shot twice with a taser, hogtied, and taken away. Now, there's a reason I tell you that story. If I couldn't help my son with my education, with my money, with my political connections, with my knowledge, for God's sakes, I just spent 3 years and written a book about the system. If I couldn't help my son get the help he needed, what chance? What chance does somebody who's psychotic, doesn't speak the language, doesn't have the money, doesn't have the connections, doesn't have anybody help, what chance do they have getting through our system? Now, I'm happy to report that Mike, for the last 3 years, has been doing great. He's had 4 major breakdowns. I handled every one of them horribly. He's doing great now. He's peer-to-peer. He actually works going into jails, helping people who have mental illnesses, and I'm very proud of him. The message behind that is have hope, don't give up. Now I'm going to close by telling a story. I'm going to give you a warning because I am from Washington. This is a political disclaimer. You are being warned. I am about to tell a religious story. I am not endorsing any religious group, party, affiliation. I just like this story, okay? And I like this story because of the moral in it, and I think it will be helpful to you too. And there's a reason I tell it. I grew up in Oklahoma. My dad was a preacher. Anybody who knows anything about Oklahoma and preachers means I got dragged to church every Wednesday night, every Saturday, every Sunday, and I got real good at watching my dad sitting there like this, thinking about everything else in the world but what he was saying. But there was always one story from the New Testament that he'd tell that would snap me right to attention, and that's because it's about a woman who's having sex. Now, you can find them in there. You just got to know where to look, okay? Now, you probably know this story. A woman's caught in adultery. Please note it's always the women in the Bible who are caught in adultery. And she's dragged into the center of the town. They're going to stone her. They're going to kill her because of this horrible thing that she has done. And they gather around, they all picking up their stones, and then Jesus says, "Let ye who's never sinned throw that very first stone." And one by one, the people drop the stones. And they walk away because they know none of us is pure, none of us is innocent. All of us have committed sins. Unfortunately, we live in a world today where people are eager to pick up those rocks. They don't drop those stones. They want to stone people. They want to lock up people who are different, people with mental illnesses, people who they're afraid of. They want to stone them. They want to drive them away. They want them in our jails and our prisons. As persons with mental illnesses, as family members, as providers, as you have come together today because of your interest in this, I believe you have been called on to become what I call stone catchers. People who step between that angry mob and people who can't defend themselves until they get strong enough that they can join you. And it's the stone catchers in our society who give me hope. My son has a mental illness. This cruel disease to me wears his face, and I will be forever grateful to people who can look beyond the madness in his eye and see a person of wealth, of worth, who has parents who love him, brothers and sisters. So thank you. Thank you for coming today to participate in this. Thank you for being a stone catcher. Thank you for being involved. I can guarantee you, you get involved in mental health reform and you'll change lives. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You're very kind. I've been asked to introduce the next speaker. Thank you very much. It's Leslie Tremaine. We're doing this now, right? Yep. Leslie's been involved in public mental health for over 30 years. She's either really stubborn, or she's passionate, or I would assume she's both.
Yes.
She began her career in clinical work in schools and in rural community mental health settings, and also served as director of both local and state mental health services in, get this, Indiana, Virginia, New Orleans, Colorado, New Mexico, and now California. You moved a lot.
Mm-hmm.
At all levels, she has been most focused on how to help systems as well as individuals, making the changes needed to function efficiently. This has meant, at times, pushing at the edges of comfort and familiarity with systems undergoing change, and that edge is where she believes real learning takes place for all of us. She strongly believes that systems function best when they are clearly responsive to both value and values, how to serve as good stewards of public resources while helping communities and individuals to improve quality of life for those affected by mental health needs. Like with individuals, crisis can serve to help drive some important systematic change. Leslie is working now to find ways that our current budget-driven crises will create opportunities for improvements in recovery in Santa Cruz County. Leslie?
Thank you. Thank you. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here, and for me, a very different experience in some sense than some of our previous speakers, both more nervous-making and less so, because I'm home. And that means I see lots of people I know, and that's great. It also means I got to live with the results of what I say, and you all will hold me accountable, and I know it. Somebody asked if I was nervous, and I said, no, I'm not nervous because it would be absolutely impossible to really fully meet up to the expectations we all have and to follow on the acts we've heard already today. So what I'm going to do is just tell you my own truth, because I think that's what our three previous speakers have done. I know I'm the one who's to talk about systems issues and big things like what's going on in the state of California and across the country, but I can only do that by beginning with my own truth. And I think you can only really hear well by beginning with yours. So I would ask you for just a second to stop and think about what brought you here today. You don't have to say it to anybody else, so be real honest. What brought you here today? In that 30 seconds or so of silence, I doubt very seriously anybody came here today because they have completely given up hope that mental health systems can work better. You're here because, like Pete asked us to, you care and you believe that systems can work better. Are they broken right now? Absolutely. Absolutely. Starting right here in our own county. It doesn't work the way any of us probably really want, day in, day out, for every single person. But you're here today because, like me, you are passionate and stubborn, and you haven't given up. I had someone in another state in which I was working listen to me speak, and afterwards come up to me, and I didn't know if I was insulted or what. He said, "You sound really smart and bright. What are you doing working in the public sector?" He said, "Haven't you just given up on them?" He said, that it's broken, it doesn't work. And I looked him in the eye and I said, no. Some people do give up and they walk away from those things that hurt and are hard to do. I won't do that. I'm still here and I'll stay here. And it's not always easy to do because, unlike some other folks here, our other three speakers perhaps, I look around this room and I see people we work with every day, some of whom I know we haven't done as well for as we'd like. Okay? That's not easy to do. But we can't walk away. And we can't give up. And we can't give up on each other. So I want to tell you a little bit about my own story of not giving up and kind of how I got to being here in California today, because I think some good storytelling has helped us in hearing from our other three speakers, and I want to add my voice to that. It's a little hard to do. It feels a little vulnerable, but I think it's really important. Because, you know, my path to get here wasn't just a matter of going to graduate school and getting a particular degree and picking a particular career. It wasn't an accident I picked this career. Not very far from here, over the hill in Palo Alto, California, my uncle shot himself. He had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. He'd been discharged from a state hospital in California. He'd been discharged from a veterans hospital in Palo Alto. He left that hospital, and that very same day, he gave up. And I remembered that. And I wanted to understand what happened to my uncle and what happened in a state that, like Pete described, sent people like my uncle out with nothing, with no hope. I think you probably remember, some of you, the era I'm talking about when that happened, 1960s. So I said, I think it could have been better than that. I know my uncle. I think he could have made it. What would it take? And got started with that curiosity and that personal kind of pain from my family on a career that I'm still in 40 plus years later. Where that path has taken me Most of the learning I've done didn't come at the start in graduate school. It came from the School of Hard Knocks, like many of us, and it came from people. And I want to tell you a little bit about my career in terms of some of the people who've really been the most important teachers for me along the way. I started my career in rural Colorado. I had no idea what I was doing. I had a fancy doctorate in some academic field, and I thought I wanted to go into work as an academician and a researcher. But I thought I probably needed to get some stories first. You know, you have to have something to say in the classroom. So I went into community mental health in a town that actually had more cattle than people. But it was a beautiful place, and I'd seen it advertised as a job in a Sierra Club magazine, and it sounded like a great place for skiing and hiking and biking and all that stuff I was interested in then. And I was supposed to spend my days sitting in an office having 50-minute-hour discussions with people who'd been discharged from the state hospital down the road in Pueblo. We'd look at each other and we'd both wonder, what are we doing here? It made no sense. One day, one of those people, Donald, didn't come into the office, and I called and said, Donald, what's up? You didn't make your appointment, because I'm thinking, well, I got to get my Medicaid units in, you know, and I didn't see Donald today. Donald was 70 years old, by the way, and he'd been in the hospital down in Pueblo for decades before coming home. And he said, my mom's sick and I got to take care of her. And I said, you're 70-some years old, your mom is sick? He said, yeah, I take care of my elderly mom. And I said, well, Donald, would you mind if I came over to the house and we could talk there? And he said, no, that'd be great, you could meet my mom. Well, my whole view of the world changed, in a sense, starting that day. Because when I got home with Donald and I got inside his life, I didn't see a schizophrenic discharged from the state hospital. I saw this man taking care of a 90-some-year-old mother who had a whole, rich, complex life and history. And I sat there with him and his mom, and I figured out they needed some help with food, and there were things broken in the house that needed repairs, and we could get some homemaker services in, and we could get a visiting nurse, and we could do some things. And I didn't know it was called community support services, but it was a heck of a lot more fun than sitting in my office not knowing what to talk to Donald about. And his mom said to me, you know, you could help me too. Donald is pretty good at taking care of me, but he doesn't know how to braid my hair. And I thought, this is the job. I got a 90-some-year-old lady telling me about crossing the prairie while I'm braiding her hair, and I get paid for this. You know, I thought it was a pretty good deal. But Donald started doing better and better, okay? And so did some of the other people that I no longer saw in my office. And I started finding out that some of them actually thought they could help other people. So rather than sending folks to the state hospital, we started finding homes where people had kids maybe who'd gone off to college or whatever, and they said, you know, when that person's having a crisis, send them over here. We'd be happy to help. And they had good parenting skills, or they had good life skills or whatever, and we started doing that. Because it was a long drive down that canyon to Pueblo State Hospital. And staff didn't particularly like doing it, so they were pretty happy to try these ideas I was trying about respite homes. And I didn't even know any of this had fancy names. I left Colorado, and what Donald taught me about the real world being a much better place to work with people and real life issues mattering more than anything we talked about just sitting in a 50-minute hour. And I got a job in Virginia that, again, I sort of just happened into with the State Department of Mental Health. And one thing kind of led to another, and the next thing I knew, I'd been given a huge promotion. And I was being